I will never forget that moment. "This is for you, Madison," my stepfather Chase said, sliding a small velvet box across the table toward me. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it felt like something more, something I wasn't ready to understand. My mom, Brooke, sat beside him, laughing softly, twirling her champagne glass between her fingers. She had that light, effortless smile she always wore during celebrations, the kind that said everything was perfect in our world. She had had no idea it was my 21st birthday, and we were celebrating at an upscale rooftop restaurant downtown. The city lights glittered all around us like stars had fallen to earth, wrapping us in this false sense of luxury and security, the kind of place where people dressed their best, whispered over candlelight, and pretended they didn't have secrets. But we did. I hesitated before opening the box, my fingers trembling slightly. I told myself I was being silly, it was just a gift, right? But when I lifted the lid, my breath caught in my throat. Inside was a delicate diamond ring, simple, elegant, but too intimate, way too intimate for a stepfather's gift. What is this?" I asked, forcing a shaky laugh, trying to keep things light. Chase leaned in closer, his breath warm against my ear, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "It's not just a gift," he whispered, his eyes gleamed under the flickering candlelight. "It's a symbol of our special connection, you know what I mean." I froze, my stomach twisted into knots. What the hell did he just say? I glanced at my mom, she was still smiling, raising her glass for a toast, blissfully unaware that her husband had just crossed a line he could never uncross. And that ring, it wasn't just going to sit on my finger, it was about to shatter everything. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, but no one else at that table could see it. I tried to mask the shock on my face as I closed the box and set it down gently, like if I didn't touch it, this whole thing would just disappear. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Was this a joke? Was I misinterpreting? But deep down, I already knew the truth. There was no misunderstanding. Chase leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine like nothing had happened. His eyes flicked to me now and then with a glint that made my skin crawl. "Do you like it?" he asked, loud enough for my mom to hear, his tone dripping with faux innocence. I forced a smile, my voice barely steady. "It's unexpected." My mom giggled, nudging his arm. "Chase, you're spoiling her," I told him. "She doesn't need anything fancy, she deserves it." He replied smoothly, his eyes never leaving mine. "She's becoming a woman, she should have something special." Those words hit me like a slap. My mom just laughed, completely oblivious, raising her glass again. I couldn't believe what was happening. How could she not see it? I felt trapped, suffocating in that chair, while the city lights sparkled around us like nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong, so wrong. And I knew in that exact moment, Chase had crossed a line that should never, ever be crossed, a line that couldn't be undone. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at that ring, knowing one thing for certain, he had crossed a boundary that should never have been crossed. After that night at the restaurant, I did everything I could to avoid Chase. I stayed out late with friends, buried myself in university work, and made sure never to be alone in the same room with him. But no matter how hard I tried to distance myself, he always found a way to get closer. It started with small, accidental gestures, a brush of his hand against mine when we passed in the hallway, standing too close in the kitchen while I poured coffee, and then the gifts began. At first, it was subtle, a bottle of expensive perfume left on my dresser with no note, but I knew it was from him, the same scent he once told me smelled mature on me. Then came a delicate bracelet, thin silver, with a tiny charm engraved with our initials, C and M. My heart stopped when I saw it. He didn't even bother hiding what he was doing anymore. I wanted to throw it back in his face, scream at him to stop, but something about the way he looked at me, like he was waiting for me to react, froze me in place. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to acknowledge this twisted game he was playing. So I said nothing, but inside, I was screaming. A week later, my mom had to leave town for a business trip, 3 whole days. I thought about staying at a friend's place, finding any excuse not to be alone with Chase, but before I could even plan my escape, he cornered me in the kitchen one morning, holding a set of car keys. "I was thinking," he said, his voice smooth, like this was just another casual conversation. "We haven't spent much time together lately. How about a weekend at the lake house?" I stared at him, my throat tightening. "Why would I do that?" I shot back, trying to keep my voice steady. His smile didn't falter. It's just a family getaway, Madison. Your mom would love to know we're bonding. She's been worried about you, you know." His eyes narrowed slightly, as if daring me to argue. I felt trapped. He was manipulating me, using my mom as leverage. If I refused, he'd twist it, make it seem like I was the one acting strange, and if I told my mom, I could already hear her voice in my head. "Chase is just trying to be nice, Madison. Why are you being so difficult?" I swallowed hard and forced a nod. "Fine." But in my mind, I was screaming again. The lake house was even more isolated than I remembered. Tucked deep in the woods, it sat right on the edge of a still, dark lake, surrounded by towering pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt like a prison. As soon as we arrived, I checked my phone. No service, of course. "It's nice to disconnect sometimes," Chase said behind me, like he knew exactly what I was doing. No distractions. Just as I forced a tight smile and muttered something about unpacking, as I dragged my suitcase upstairs, I felt his eyes on my back, heavy and unblinking. The first night passed in intense silence. I stayed in my room, pretending to be tired, but sleep was impossible. I lay awake listening for footsteps in the hall, half expecting him to come knocking, but he didn't, not yet. The second night was worse. Chase knocked on my door just before sunset. "Come downstairs," he called through the wood. I opened a bottle of wine. "Let's relax by the fire." My heart pounded in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to lock the door and wait for morning. But I knew if I refused, it would only make things worse. He'd accuse me of being rude, ungrateful, and the last thing I wanted was to make him angry while we were trapped in this house together. So I went downstairs. The living room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the crackling fire in the stone hearth. Chase was sitting on the couch, 2 glasses of red wine on the coffee table in front of him. He patted the cushion beside him, that same unsettling smile on his face. "Sit, Madison." "I don't bite." I hesitated for a moment before perching on the edge of the couch, as far from him as possible. I could feel the heat of the fire on my skin, but it did nothing to chase away the chill creeping up my spine. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackle of burning wood. I stared into the flames, praying he'd get bored and leave me alone, but of course he didn't. "You know," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate, "I've always noticed you." My stomach dropped. I gripped my wine glass tightly, my knuckles turning white. "You're not a little girl anymore, Madison," he continued, his eyes fixed on me. "You've grown into a beautiful woman, and I see the way you look at me." I snapped my head toward him, my heart hammering in my chest. "You're sick," I whispered, my voice shaking, but he just smiled, leaning closer. "We could be happy, Madison, if you just stop fighting it." I shot up from the couch, my pulse racing. "I'm going to bed," I muttered, heading for the stairs. But his voice stopped me cold. "You can't run from this forever," he called after me, his tone darkening. "You know it." "I know it." I didn't look back. I bolted up the stairs, slammed my door shut, and locked it again. But I knew I couldn't stay here forever. I had to find a way out somehow. Because now I knew one thing for sure. Chase wasn't just playing games anymore, and I was running out of time. I didn't sleep that night. Lying in the cold, unfamiliar guest room of the lake house, I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding with every creak and groan of the old wooden walls. But it wasn't the house settling that kept me awake, it was Chase. I could hear him, his slow, deliberate footsteps echoed down the narrow hallway, stopping now and then just outside my door. I held my breath each time, waiting for the handle to turn, for him to push his way in, but he didn't, not yet. Instead, he was waiting for me to let my guard down, waiting for the moment he thought I'd be defenseless. But I wasn't going to give him that chance. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains, I had made up my mind. I was going to get out of there, no matter what it took. I moved quietly, careful not to make a sound, as I grabbed my backpack and stuffed it with whatever I could. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped my phone, but I managed to slip it into my pocket, even though I knew there was no signal. My heart raced as I cracked the door open, peeking into the hallway. Silence. I crept down the stairs, my bare feet making almost no noise on the cold wooden floor. The house was still dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. I didn't see him. Maybe he was still asleep. Maybe this would be easier than I thought. I reached for the front door, praying it wouldn't squeak, but as soon as I stepped onto the porch, The old wooden boards betrayed me with a loud, sharp creak. And that's when I heard it. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was right behind me, low and dangerous. My blood ran cold. I turned slowly, my heart slamming against my ribs. Chase stood in the doorway, blocking my only exit, the keys to his car dangling from his fingers. His expression was calm, but his eyes were wild, glinting with something between amusement and madness. "You thought you could just leave?" he asked, stepping closer. "You really think you can run from this?" "This is a mistake," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let me go meet Chase. I won't say anything, I just want to go home." But he only smiled, a slow, sinister curve of his lips that made my skin crawl. "A mistake," he repeated softly. "No, Madison, this isn't a mistake, this is destiny." And that's when I knew talking wasn't going to work. With everything I had, I lunged at him, grabbing for the keys in his hand. He wasn't expecting it. His grip loosened just enough for me to rip them free. I didn't hesitate. I bolted down the porch steps, my feet pounding against the dirt path as I sprinted toward the car. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps thundering in my ears as he shouted my name, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. I could hear him getting closer, feel his presence closing in on me, but finally, mercifully, the key slid into the ignition. I jumped inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it just as Chase reached the car, pounding his fists against the window. "Open the door, Madison," he roared, his face twisted in fury. "You can't run from me." But I didn't stop, I didn't even breathe. I turned the key, the engine sputtered to life, and I fled, tearing down the narrow, winding road that led away from the lake house, away from him. The tires skidded on the gravel, the car fishtailing slightly as I gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. The dense forest blurred past me, the trees like dark sentinels closing in from both sides, but I didn't care, I just kept driving. I didn't look back, but I knew deep down in the pit of my stomach, I knew this wasn't over. The further I drove, the more the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving behind a sick, gnawing fear. My mind raced with questions. What if he followed me? What if he found another way to trap me? But the road was empty, the only sound the hum of the engine and my own ragged breathing. When I finally saw the highway up ahead, I felt a flicker of hope, civilization, safety, but that hope was short-lived. As I merged onto the highway, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. Headlights, bright and unrelenting, gaining on me fast. My heart dropped. It couldn't be him, but deep down I knew it was. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, pushing the car to its limits, but the headlights stayed with me, matching my speed, closing the distance. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't outrun him forever. I needed help. I needed to find someone, anyone who could stop him. And then I saw it up ahead, a gas station, small, isolated, but open. I swerved into the parking lot, tires screeching as I slammed on the brakes. I jumped out of the car, sprinting toward the entrance, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. "Help!" I screamed, bursting through the door. "Please, someone help me." The cashier, a young guy, maybe a few years older than me, looked up, startled. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes widening when he saw the terror on my face. "My stepfather, he's trying to." I couldn't even finish the sentence, the words caught in my throat, choked by fear. But the guy didn't need an explanation. He grabbed the phone, dialing 911, as I crouched behind the counter, my whole body trembling. Outside, I could see Chase's car pulling into the lot, his headlights cutting through the darkness like knives, but he didn't get out. He just sat there, staring at the gas station, his face a shadow behind the glass, and then, just as suddenly as he arrived, he pulled away, his tires kicking up gravel as he sped off into the night. But even as I watched his car disappear down the road, I knew this wasn't over. Chase wouldn't give up that easily. When the police arrived, I told them everything about the gifts, the lake house, the way he'd cornered me and tried to keep me there. But even as I spoke, I could see the doubt in their eyes, no bruises, no physical proof, just my word against his. And Chase, he was smart. He knew exactly how to play the victim, how to twist the story to make it seem like I was the one causing trouble. "She's been acting out," I could already hear him saying. "She's confused, maybe even a little unstable." The thought made me sick, but I wasn't going to let him win. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to find a way to expose him, to make sure everyone saw the truth, because one thing was clear, Chase wasn't done with me, and I wasn't done with him. When I finally made it home, I was ready to tell my mom everything. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with the words I had rehearsed over and over during the drive. I thought she would see the truth in my eyes, hear the fear in my voice, and believe me. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. There, they were, my mom and Chase, sitting side by side on the living room couch, as if they had been waiting for me. The sight of them together made my stomach twist, but what really knocked the breath out of me was the look on my mom's face. She wasn't worried, she wasn't confused, she was angry. "Madison, what is this?" Her voice was sharp, full of irritation. "What kind of games are you playing?" I froze in the doorway, my pulse racing. Games? I didn't understand. But then Chase stood up, his face the perfect mask of concern. "Brooke," I tried to be patient with her, he said softly, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "But she's been acting out. I think she's struggling with us." My heart dropped, he had gotten to her first. "You lying?" I shouted, stepping forward, my voice shaking with anger. "Mom, you don't understand," I pleaded. Her voice cracked like a whip, her eyes burned with frustration, but not at Chase, at me. "Chase told me everything. Madison, you're making up these stories because you're jealous. You can't stand that I'm happy." Jealous? The word hit me like a slap. He had twisted everything, painted me as some bitter, unstable daughter trying to sabotage their marriage. "Mom, please," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "You have to believe me." But she just shook her head, her face hard and closed off. "I don't know what's gotten into you," she muttered, "but you need to stop this nonsense." I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. The one person I thought would protect me was siding with him. And Chase, he just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, a faint smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. He had won. The days that followed were pure torture. Chase acted like nothing had happened. He moved through the house with ease, laughing, smiling, pretending to be the perfect husband and stepfather. But when my mom wasn't looking, he showed his true face. It started with the notes slipped under my door late at night, each one more twisted than the last. "You can't hide from me. I know you feel it too. Your mom won't believe you, no one will." Each word felt like a knife, cutting deeper into my already frayed nerves. I tried to ignore them, to pretend they didn't get to me, but they did. I started locking my door at night, but it didn't help. I could still hear him in the hallway, his footsteps slow and deliberate, pausing just outside my room long enough to make sure I knew he was there. I felt trapped in my own home, but the worst part wasn't the notes, it was the looks. Chase would catch my eye during dinner, his gaze lingering just a second too long. When my mom turned her back, he brushed past me, his hand grazing my arm, my back. Each touch made my skin crawl, but I couldn't show it, I couldn't give him the satisfaction. "We could be happy, Madison," he whispered one night as he passed me in the hallway. "If you just stop fighting it." I clenched my fist, biting back the scream building in my throat. I wanted to hit him to do something, but I knew that's what he wanted. He wanted me to lose control, to give my mom more reasons to believe his lies. So I stayed silent, but inside, I was boiling. I felt like I was losing control of my life. Every day was a struggle to keep it together, to act normal when everything around me was crumbling. My mom barely spoke to me, unless it was to lecture me about my attitude. Chase's presence was suffocating, a constant reminder that I was alone in this fight. Then, one night, lying awake in the dark, an idea came to me. If Chase could play games, so could I. I realized I couldn't just wait for him to slip up, I needed to make him slip up. I needed proof, something undeniable, something that would force my mom to see the truth. And I knew exactly how to get it. I started by pretending to give in. The next morning, I joined them for breakfast, forcing a smile as I sat down at the table. Chase raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my sudden change in attitude, but he said nothing. "Morning," I chirped, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "I'm sorry for how I've been acting. I guess I've just been stressed." My mom glanced at me, suspicion flickering in her eyes, but she seemed relieved. "I'm glad you're finally realizing that," she said, her tone softening slightly. Chase just smiled, that smug look returning to his face. "It's good to see you coming around," he murmured, his eyes locking onto mine. I felt a wave of nausea, but I forced myself to hold his gaze, to smile back, let him think he was winning. For the next few days, I kept up the act. I was polite, even friendly, laughing at Chase's jokes, helping out around the house. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the way he was trying to figure out what had changed, but I knew what I was doing. I was lulling him into a false sense of security, and then, when he least expected it, I'd strike. One evening, when my mom was out with friends, Chase and I were alone in the house. I was in the living room, pretending to read a book, when he walked in. "You really changed, Madison," he said, sitting down on the couch beside me. "I knew you'd come around eventually." I felt my skin crawl, but I kept my composure. "Maybe I just needed time," I replied softly, not looking at him. He leaned in closer, his hand resting on my knee. "I always knew you'd see it, the connection between us." I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. "I see it now," I whispered, forcing a smile, "but maybe we should take it slow." Chase's eyes darkened, but he nodded, his hand squeezing my knee. "Whatever you want, Madison. I'm not going anywhere." And neither was I, because now I had him exactly where I wanted. But the game wasn't over yet. Chase still thought he was in control, but soon he'd realize just how wrong he was, because I had a plan, and this time I was going to win. I knew he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Chase wasn't the type to give up easily, and I wasn't naive enough to think his twisted obsession with me would just fade away. So I decided to flip the script. If he wanted to play games, I'd play them better. I started acting like I was warming up to him, small, calculated smiles when he'd glance my way, light, casual touches when we passed in the hallway. I even laughed at his pathetic jokes during dinner. I could see it in his eyes, his confidence growing, his guard slipping. He thought he was winning, but the truth was, I was setting the stage. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where my mom had gone to bed early, I made my move. "Chase," I said softly, stepping into the living room where he was sitting, sipping his usual glass of bourbon. He looked up, surprised by my gentle tone. "Can we talk?" His lips curled into that familiar, smug smile of his. "Of course, Madison," he said, patting the seat next to him, and I sat down, careful to keep just the right amount of distance, not too far, not too close. "I've been thinking," I began, lowering my gaze as if I were embarrassed about us. His eyes gleamed. I could almost hear his pulse quicken. "Go on," he urged, his voice dropping to that smooth, manipulative tone he always used when he thought he was in control. I swallowed hard, forcing a shy smile. Maybe I was wrong about everything. Maybe I was just scared of how I felt. Chase leaned in slightly, his hand brushing against mine. "I knew you'd come around, Madison. I knew you'd feel it too." I forced myself to meet his gaze, ignoring the bile rising in my throat, but I don't want to sneak around here. "Let's go somewhere special, just you and me." That was all it took. A week later, I set the final part of my plan into motion. I invited him to the same rooftop restaurant where this nightmare had started, the place where he had given me that cursed ring. It felt poetic, like the universe was giving me a chance to close the circle. Chase didn't suspect a thing. He showed up, dressed impeccably, wearing that same confident smile that once sent chills down my spine. But tonight, I wasn't afraid. Tonight, I was in control. We sat at a secluded table, the city lights glittering around us. I made sure to play the part perfectly, nervous glances, soft laughter, leaning in just enough to keep him hooked. And when the timing was right, I made my move. I pulled out my phone, discreetly sliding it under the table and hitting the record button. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept my face calm, my voice steady. "Now we can finally be together, right?" I whispered, my eyes wide with false hope. "Yes, Madison," he murmured, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Your mom doesn't matter anymore. It's just you and me now." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I forced a smile. I had what I needed. The rest of the evening was a blur. I played along until the check was paid and the night was over. But the moment I stepped out of that restaurant, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I had him. When I got home, my hands trembled as I replayed the recording, listening to his disgusting words over and over, solidifying the proof I needed. The next morning, I found my mom in the kitchen, sipping her coffee like it was just another ordinary day. I sat across from her, my heart pounding. "Mom," I began quietly, "I need you to listen to something." She sighed, already bracing herself for another dramatic outburst, but I didn't let her brush me off this time. I placed my phone on the table and hit play. At first, she looked bored, her eyes darting toward the window as if she wasn't interested in what I had to say. But then, Chase's voice filled the room. Your mom doesn't matter anymore. It's just you and me now. Her face went pale. She stared at the phone, frozen, as the weight of his words sank in. I watched as the color drained from her cheeks, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her coffee mug. Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "At the restaurant," I replied, my voice steady, "the same one where he gave me that ring." Silence filled the kitchen. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between denial and the horrifying truth. But there was no escaping it now. The evidence was undeniable. Without another word, she stood up and left the room. I didn't know where she was going, but I didn't care. I had done my part. The next day, Chase was arrested. The sight of him being led out of our house in handcuffs was surreal. He didn't fight, he didn't scream, he just turned his head and gave me one last, chilling smile, as if to say this isn't over. But it was the ring that was supposed to symbolize our new life that became the final nail in his coffin. It was proof of his manipulation, his obsession, his crimes. I watched from the window as the police car disappeared down the street, taking him out of my life for good. But even as the house grew quiet, even as the weight of his presence lifted, I knew I'd never be the same. Later that evening, my mom sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where she had once accused me of lying. She looked older, worn down by guilt and betrayal. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I should have believed you. I wanted to forgive her. I wanted to tell her everything was okay. But it wasn't." "You should have," I replied softly, standing up and leaving her alone in the silence. Because the truth was, the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones who lurk in the shadows, they're the ones who hide behind the mask of family, and I'd never let anyone get that close again.